So, hello everybody, my name is Peter Fulop, and as she introduced me, I've been working with clay in Ireland the last 15 years. But I did begin with clay work roughly 25 years ago. So in the last 5 years, by traveling in certain places in Asia, I kind of started to absorbing elements from the writing system of the Japanese and Chinese culture, where they... You can hear me, yeah? So, okay, I can talk like this. So I started to absorbing elements from Oriental writing system.
Yeah, do you want to maybe take this one?
That's okay, yeah. Because I have to use it. And try to transfer it on the surface of my ceramics. So the picture, what you see on the screen, it's a vessel form what I did in Japan, and I did apply some of the underglaze black stain as a form of, sort of happening form of calligraphy painting on the surface. So the calligraphy tradition of Japan, it goes back to maybe the 12th century, 11th century, where people started to using the brushwork as a part of their Buddhist practice, or the part of their meditation practice. So they try to control the brush through a very opposite way what we consider in European terms as controlling things, because we're always coming from the notion to take a full control on the action. But what they're looking for in Japan, basically they try to empty out the mind through a short period of meditation, and they're looking for patterns which is beyond the conscious thoughts and just presented on the surface. Nowadays, some of the young Japanese artists started to do a sort of a revival of this whole philosophy. They call it neo-shodo, because the Japanese name of the calligraphy system is so-called shodo. So they created this new revival of the movement, where they combining the calligraphy technique with sort of a very dynamic form of happening arts. Sometimes they use music, sounds, movements, and they use extremely large surfaces to create the artwork. This is one of an example of an extremely large finished work, which, as I remember, it's supposed to be some 6 meter by 4 meter on rice paper, and it's been created on the floor surface of a big art center. So by relying on these experiences, what I have seen in China and Japan, I started to experimenting first just on paper, like to be able to adopt, the way to control the brush in this very fast form of action. So I went to an art residency program in Ireland, where I had a large space in a studio, and I started to experimenting on large paper. I wasn't able to to get the very expensive large size brushes and good size of paper, so I had to tape together any kind of paper where I can get from the art supply shop. And I did use found objects like a floor brush or a mop, whatever I found, to be able to, to transfer the ink on the paper. So these are some examples on the screen. And this is just a moment when I'm finishing up the work. And you can see some of other works on the wall. These are a few examples from that residency program. And, after practicing for a while on paper, I begin to transfer this whole technique to the surface of the ceramic. So I choose large porcelain tiles as a possible canvas for the happening form of the brush stroke. This piece on the screen, it's an 85 centimeter by 85 centimeter Chinese porcelain tile, what I was using, and I did fire it up to 1340, quite high temperature, and we introduced a very long period of reduction atmosphere to the piece, up to 5 to 7 hours in a gas kiln. These are just other pieces, which I also did in China, by using a local, sort of a semi-stone ware mixture with some porcelain body in it, just to be able to stand the very high heat, what we needed for the right effect. That's a vessel form, what I call, boxed vessels. They are quite common in Japanese tradition. People using them in tea houses, which is also related to Zen Buddhist practices. And the vessel supposed to contain certain elements from that philosophy, which responsible to calm down your mind while you are observing the piece. So you're supposed to look for some kind of a right balance, which not so much disturbance in the surface, and also the surface is what you are creating, and the shape supposed to slightly fit into the nature and the surround. So good to do some observation around the tea house or the building where you are going to install the work. Then it's a very beneficial thing to absorb elements from the natural surround and apply it to the piece what you are creating. There's a few images what I'm using for gathering inspirations, from the surround, from the nature. So sometimes walking on the street after a rainy day, you can see extremely spontaneous paintings basically on the path, which created by the accidental flow of the water. So it's that sort of action of the nature and the gravity. It's very close to the technique when I'm applying to painting those calligraphy pieces. And I also basically look around in the surround for every kind of inspiration. So sometimes the light and shadow can create very interesting contrast, but I wouldn't necessarily, totally copy on the work, but I'm just looking for a balance and a kind of an order of the patterns on the surface. While I was studying this whole subject in Japan, I was working at the Shigaraki Cultural Center Park, which is totally relying on ceramic arts and promoting ceramic arts and giving the best opportunity to the participants, to use the highest quality of the equipments. So while I was there for 3 months, I met this gentleman. His name is Mr. Ueda. Ueda's son, he's a 5th generation tea-ware master. So they have that kind of structure in the Japanese ceramic tradition where they highlight, the background of the maker, how many generations ago the family practicing this form of arts. So from the father to the son, they transfer the knowledge what they gathered within a lifetime, and then they can add their own interpretation to it. But they have quite strict regulations in the way how do they present the work. So Mr. Ueda was giving me certain corrections on the way I was throwing the pieces. He said, he heard about my interest on the philosophy of the calligraphy, and he says, there's another thing what I can add to the pieces. If I treat the surface of the vessel or the form as a 3-dimensional calligraphy, I can apply this whole notion, apply this whole technique to the way how I'm throwing the pieces, rather than just being totally practical and using the quickest way to create the shape. He suggested to slow down the whole process and looking for possible elements on the surface which created by the finger or the tool what I'm using. So it can draw patterns in the shape as it appears as a 3-dimensional form, and that can add to the value and to the visual value of the whole piece. So there is some example of his work. These are freshwater jars, what they use during the tea ceremony in Japan to get some source of fresh water to rinse out the tea bowl, and also to be able to use fresh well water for the tea itself. So I was walking around in the countryside, sometimes I came across some of the antique shops who are selling all sorts of collections of vessel forms and ceramics, and I have seen some examples, you know, on a very industrial way of use of calligraphy on the surface. And these are just other images about possible inspiration while you are walking in the streets of Japan and China, and you can absorb these elements to your work. And I will quickly show you within a few seconds just a few images how am I doing this whole process in the studio. So you can see the step-by-step record of the whole calligraphy action on a three-dimensional form. These are examples of tea bowls and a few vessels, and some pieces from, you know, before the firing and after in a woman's show what I had in Japan. And I think, unfortunately, I'm running out of time, so that was it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Oh, yeah. If you have any question, up to 2 questions, we have time for if there's any question about the technique.
There's a mic somewhere. There's a mic over here.
I have a question. Do you have a showroom where you sell your pieces? These are your pieces, right?
Yeah, these are my pieces, and I do have a website. So after the talk, I can give you my name card if you would like to see the images. And I do work with several galleries, but I don't have my own.
You don't?
No, unfortunately, I'm not that wealthy, you know, yet to be able to afford a showroom, but I do work with galleries where you can see the work.
Pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is a master's research student in the Department of Metals here in NCAD. She's a qualified jewellery designer, and she also has a background in European studies. Her first degree was in European studies. Julie Connellan, I should have said her name. And she's going to speak today about the branding of Irish and thematising of Irish jewellery in the late 19th century and the kind of subsequent effect of that on the development of jewellery in Ireland, and in particular contemporary attitudes to Irish jewellery.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa. So yeah, my name is Julie Connellan, and I'm happy to be studying here at the NCAD at the moment. And I'd like to begin by explaining that I'm attempting to give this presentation as a maker rather than as a theoretician. And I'm aware there may well be experts among you in the audience, so I'd welcome any input you might have or questions you might have after the presentation. So just to begin by giving you a little bit of background as to why I've come to this theme and why I want to look at this. I spent 3 years studying in Germany, in Pforzheim, in the southwest of Germany, studying jewellery and tableware design at the Berufskolleg für Design, Schmuck und Gerät. And while I was there, I had ready access to a really very vibrant community of makers and students, professors, galleries, museums, other types of exhibitions, annual trade fairs and symposia. So there was an awful lot going on, and all of these people were specialising in contemporary jewellery design. So due to the fact that I was travelling back and forth between Ireland and Germany over that time, it became quite clear to me that, you know, there were major differences. I'll just show you a few slides of some events in Germany. This is the International Craft Fair, Craft and Design Fair, which took place in Munich in March, and this happens every year, and there's a special area for contemporary jewellery design. It's just another, this is just the exhibition part where the jewellery was showed. At the fair, you also have international galleries represented. So Platina is in Stockholm, Matzé is in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, and Ra is in Amsterdam. So these are all galleries specialising in contemporary jewellery. It's a trip that we made to the Gallery Matzé in Nijmegen, and here are just a couple of. This is a piece on the left by Iris Bodemer, and on the right by Winfried Krüger. This is the Pinakothek der Moderne. This is a modern design. Well, it's a design museum in Munich. And during that time of the trade fair, there were also exhibitions happening here. Gianpaolo Babetto was being shown, but also Otto Künzli's class in the Academy in Munich was also being shown. I think I have a slide that's that. And you had Karl Fritsch, who curated the Dana Rotunde, which is an area within the Museum of Design which shows solely modern jewellery, really. So that's just been recently curated. This is a slide of the Schmückbar Gallery in Pforzheim, which I ran as part of a collective along with other students. And we would have exhibitions opening every 2 to 3 months, and we'd curate them and organise them together. And then when the final year students would leave, other students would come in, and we financed that ourselves. And we worked there, and we had our workshop there as well. So that's the current exhibition, and so we showed jewellery and sometimes tableware. So basically the two issues that were highlighted by this direct comparison between Germany and Ireland were, for me, the absence of any specialist experimental jewellery gallery in Ireland, and also the constant reappearance of a particular set of ornamental motifs in Irish jewellery design. These motifs of ornamentation were Celtic interlacing and national symbols. So I began to read around this topic and found a book called The Arts and Crafts Movement in Ireland by Paul Laurimore, published in 1992. And he speaks about the precursors to the arts and crafts movement in Ireland. And he makes specific reference to Dr. William Sullivan, in 1883 president of Queen's College Cork, who made an official report on the industrial exhibition in 1883. And when he did so, he spoke specifically about types of ornamentation which he felt should be used in arts and crafts in Ireland, but also he spoke about ornamentation which he felt was unsuitable. And he speaks about the harp, the round tower, and the wolf dog as being artistically incongruous. And so he felt that they shouldn't be used. On the other hand, he felt that the shamrock and Celtic interlacing was admirably suited to be used as ornamentation. So he was not alone in endorsing Celtic interlacing. We also have Margaret Stokes, who in 1887 published a handbook it was designed for craftspeople so that they could study early Christian art, and by doing so improve their technique, their finish, and she hoped that a native design identity would be developed through the study of early Christian art. So this is the kind of motifs we're talking about here. And so the handbook is full of woodcuts so that people could actually work from this. Even because it's so full of illustrations, obviously there wasn't necessarily a need. You could work from the pictures. So here we have basically two people of status within Irish society at the late 19th century endorsing particular motifs above others. Now, so obviously this kind of, in the tradition of this, the value of a piece of work is seen as contingent upon these certain motifs of ornamentation, the use of precious metals, and technical expertise. So this value system obviously supports jewellery's traditional function as a signifier of social status and economic status. So due to this emphasis on ornamentation, precious materials, and craftsmanship, formal considerations were largely neglected. And my question is it time to reevaluate this value system? I would propose an alternative value system, and I'm not saying that I'm the first to do so. It's one which already obviously exists, but this alternative value system would really place the value in the concept, in the idea, the expressive qualities of the piece, and in innovative forms. And by expressive qualities, what I mean there is that at that moment when a viewer makes an emotional connection to a piece, that's when the piece actually becomes valuable, rather than the value being seen as really dependent on the material of which it's made. These are just a couple of pieces of my pieces, which would probably adhere more to the alternative system. As you can see, these pieces are made of wood and silk. These are made of rubber and wood. And here we have modelling foam, cable, and fake nails. So here is obviously more wood, and I did use silver in this, however. I'm not anti-metal or anti-silver. I love working with metal and silver, but I think that it always depends on the theme and really as to the choices you make as regards materials. So jewellery which is judged under this proposed alternative value system can have unconventional symbolic functions. The function of my current work, of my MA, is to raise issues of identity formation and to underline particular aspects of Irish cultural heritage. So I've been working with turf because of its importance as a preserver of our cultural heritage, really. So much of the artefacts which you see in the museums have been found in the bog, and we've learnt so much about prehistoric times from the bogs, really. And so I've been looking at using turf to follow through with the theme. Here I've placed what I call new artefacts. It's a working title, I suppose, more than anything else. I've made brooches out of copper, so base metals, and tin, and the ornamentation on these is really an expression of information. The ornamentation is mapping journeys which people in my family have made, journeys of migration. So I'm looking at migration and identity within the work, and looking at how these journeys that we make, how that helps to form our identity, really, in a way. It's just another view of that. I'm also, at the moment, really happy that I got to meet James Collins, who is one of the last working tinsmiths in Ireland. And I've chosen really I'm fascinated by the way he works and the way he uses a very limited skill, or he uses a very limited tool set. But this tool set has been handed down to him from generation to generation, from father to son. And he makes amazing pieces, but using obviously quite rudimentary tools, but with great skill, with the skill that comes from a lifetime of practice. And so what I've been doing is looking at, traditionally they would have made vessels, and what I've been doing is I've been looking at the vessels and deconstructing them, and then I suppose putting them back together in different ways. So these are just some paper models of the process, and these are resulting rings made out of tin, and using specifically the tinsmith's techniques of cold joining only, really. So this is a neck piece which is, as you can see, under construction still, again using tin, and these are just some rings worn. So really the questions I'm interested in are the questions about value, and wherein does the value of a piece of jewellery lie, and what function can jewellery have, and what can jewellery express. And really I'm thinking that by changing the value criteria, the potential function of jewellery also changes, and so this could open up whole new possibilities. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so our final speaker this afternoon is Eleanor Flag, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Ulster. She has a very wide experience as a journalist and craft critic and design critic, and has a background in history initially, and has also worked in architectural history. So we'd like to welcome Eleanor, and she's going to talk about the subject of her PhD research, which is the critical context of Irish craft, or a critical context for Irish craft. Yes.
I want to look at the critical context for Irish craft and to explore some of the reasons why the studio crafts in Ireland have been perceived as lacking any sense of intellectual respectability or even an intellectual framework in which to operate. While there's no simple explanation why this situation has developed, it's possible to pinpoint a number of contributory factors, namely changes in the nature of newspaper coverage of craft, the lack of a publication that prioritises the development of a critical context for craft, The closure of the Dublin-based space-sponsored craft galleries that existed in the 1980s and up to the early 1990s, and finally the poor communication between institutions of learning and those in professional practice. In exploring this, I'm going to draw on two sources, my own experience as a journalist since 2001 and my PhD research project, which looks at the history of the studio crafts movement in Ireland from 1970 to the mid-90s. So 1970 on is the period I'm looking at now. To start with journalism, there's currently no Irish newspaper in which craft is discussed with any analytical depth or critical sensibility. In both newspapers and magazines, craft tends to be presented in a context that's promotional rather than critical, and as an entity that needs to be supported rather than developed. To the extent that most contemporary writing in Irish craft is simply an exercise in PR. This point was highlighted by Sean McCrum in 1999 when he noted that both makers and the public are caught in a critical uncertainty about themselves and frequently show the same nervousness in receiving or offering critiques. The time is long past, he wrote, when it is enough to be glad that there is any design at all happening here. The area has now expanded to a point where this attitude has become a negative and dangerous goodwill. However, reading some of the crafts journalism in the Irish Times in the 1970s and 80s, you find that craft was, during these decades, a topic considered worthy of serious debate. Journalists at this time tended to discuss the crafts with regard to their potential economic and cultural role as well as their heritage value. From the early 1970s, Ida Grehan used the Women First section of the Irish Times to present a series of politically insightful, provocative analyses of the incipient crafts movement. Later in the 1980s, Una Lihan wrote a regular craft column in the Irish Times, which, although it tended towards a description of various craft practices and events, rather than criticism or analysis, was situated in the Arts and Studies page, indicating a level of recognition of craft as a cultural contributor. Interestingly, it seems that this coverage was not linked to the aesthetic quality of the actual craft objects. The 1970s and early 1980s were formative years for the studio crafts movement. The work was energetic and vibrant, but the standard was mixed and is generally considered to have improved a great deal since that time. However, in these early years, craft attracted much more attention from the critics than has recently been the case. In the 1980s, craft exhibitions were reviewed in a range of national newspapers. The reviewers were often, although not always, well informed, and the work was reviewed as craft rather than fine art. To kind of focus in on this bit, I want to talk about an exhibition of wood turning by Maria van Kesteren and linen tapestry wool hangings by Alice Roden. This exhibition opened in the She Arms House in Kilkenny in August 1981 as part of Kilkenny Arts Week, and then moved to the Kilkenny shop on Nassau Street. Although Van Kesteren had spent a year working as a designer with the Kilkenny Design Workshop between 1966 and 1967, the work that she showed in 1981 would have been unusual and challenging to an Irish context. Her work is distinguished by her use of the circle as a form, the fact that all the work is done on the lathe, and the fact that she obliterates the grain of the wood. All of these facets were unusual in the 1980s, a time when wood turning was dominated by an expressive emphasis on grain and burls. In an appreciation published as part of the exhibition catalogue, Sonia Landwehr described Van Kesteren's work as a series of half-rounded rings that fit tightly into each other. She develops a further group of inhaling shapes reminiscent of vortexes, and then she breaks out of the circle, starts cutting it, raising the cut shapes vertically, compressing them together. Her development now tends towards sculptural autonomous pure form. Very unfortunately, I haven't been able to find pictures of the exhibition, This is Van Kestren's recent work, and I know that the work that she exhibited in 1981 would have been much simpler than this and much plainer. The exhibition, once it came to Dublin, was reviewed in 3 national newspapers, the Irish Times, the Irish Press and the Irish Independent. For the Irish Times, Harriet Cook wrote that Maria Van Kestren is wood turner, a deviationist who works in wood that has been either bleached white or dyed black to minimise grain. I find this unsympathetic. Wood is lovely stuff and the grain is integral to its beauty. Remove that and there is little reason not to use resin. She shows rising shapes which look a little bit like beehives, propulsive shapes which are UFO-ish when flat and have strongly delineated inner rings when built up. An unnamed journalist for the Irish Press produced a slightly clumsy review that drew heavily on Van Kestren's artist statement for content. And I quote again, Maria Van Kestren is a purist to the extent that even the colour of certain woods and their susceptibility to distortion through atmospheric conditions is an anathema to her. These sturdy vessels, receptacles now on show at the Kilkenny Design Shop, Nassau Street, have wide bases, rather reminiscent of a baby's or a dog's feeding dish. While viewing them, I heard guffaws of laughter from people passing by. Now, the third review, by Mary McGarth of the Irish Independent, considered the same exhibition but concentrated on a sensitive appraisal of Alice Roden's work, writing that the linen tapestry wool hangings by the weaver Alice Roden are a progression from her progression from her already known work. She has hitherto mainly used whites and greys, but now she's introducing colours, gentle and mellow, which she dyes herself. McGarth then quotes from a statement by Roden, usually colour eliminates any creative appreciation of beauty. It's hard to use colour, Roden wrote, and stay close to the truth. Now, irrespective of the opinions of the reviewers, what is interesting here is the thoroughness with which a craft exhibition was reviewed in the national press. I use the word craft advisedly. Landor wrote in the catalogue that a number of craftsmen, without denying their craft and materials, have become well-known artists in their own right. And she described Van Kestren as a perfect example of this trend. However, I would argue that in the case of this particular exhibition, the work was exhibited as craft rather than art. Firstly, it was shown in Dublin's Kilkenny shop, then the showcase of the Kilkenny Design Workshop, rather than in a fine art gallery like the Hendricks Gallery. Secondly, the juxtaposition of wood with another craft medium, in this case woven tapestry, supports its positioning within the craft spectrum. Now moving on from journalism to talk about what I consider the most concerted effort to develop an intellectual framework for Irish craft, which was Craft Review, published between 1987 and 1992 by the Crafts Council of Ireland under the directorship of Terry Kelly. Craft Review was really an excellent publication. It was edited by Bernadette Magna with the purpose of stimulating the crafts by creating a forum for critical review and debate, specifically to stir the debate up among makers. Craft Review had a limited circulation, focused on the membership of the Crafts Council of Ireland. It was deliberately contentious, intended to provoke reactions and to offer a protective forum within which craft issues could be discussed, and it invited critics from outside the craft world. Since it did not attempt to market craft to the general public, it avoided falling into the trap of confusing commercial promotion with critical writing. However, without revenue from advertising, the print run remained tiny, copies are rare now, if you have them, hold on to them, and the magazine was discontinued in 1993 when the new executive of the Crafts Council, Christine Ross, decided to give Craft Review a decent burial. With the demise of Craft Review, craft writing lost its official voice. The 1990s saw a significant change in the way that craft was reported in the newspapers, with critical reviews of exhibitions and reports on craft practices as small business ventures, giving way to consumer articles written with the aim of helping readers locate product to decorate their homes. The rise of lifestyle journalism in 1990s Ireland was propelled by a complexity of social and economic factors, many of which were linked to the property boom. Irish editors and journalists, writing about an increasingly globalised marketplace, sought stories about Irish product as a means of affirming their publication's Irish identity. Now, Rosemary Hill has commented that a great deal of studio craft is well served by the kind of illustrated features that run in supplements and monthly magazines. In some cases, the subject would be further illuminated by a more analytical kind of criticism, but she says not always. Not all studio craft work aims at the aesthetic intensity of sculpture or to be a critique of the human condition. Now, some types of craft did receive media coverage throughout the time. I want to make the point that some craft does comment on the human condition and that the media often failed to distinguish between the two ends of the craft spectrum. Craft, perceived as a whole, became associated with lifestyle journalism, a highly feminized branch of journalism that was seen within media hierarchies as decorative and trivial. It eroded craft's intellectual credibility. It became much less likely to receive coverage on the arts or culture pages, and much less likely to be considered a fit topic for philosophical debate. At the same time, a dramatic escalation in fine art activity in 1990s Ireland filled the arts pages and preoccupied the critics. In the most mundane sense of the world, there was no space left for craft in the culture sections of the newspapers. Changes in gallery support for the studio crafts from the late 1980s may also have contributed to the decline of critical review of craft exhibitions. When the Kilkenny Design Workshops closed in November 1998, the crafts lost a centrally situated, street-level exhibition venue with an active exhibitions policy and a very effective public relations team. Although the Kilkenny shop in Nassau Street swiftly reopened under new management, it was no longer an exhibition venue and became merely a craft shop. However, the impact of this closure was softened by the opening of the new Crafts Council HQ gallery in the Powerscourt Townhouse Centre in March 1988. HQ offered a Dublin-based gallery and retail space that was accessible to journalists. In the mid-1990s, when the Crafts Council of Ireland administration relocated to Kilkenny, the HQ gallery closed. The Crafts Council moved their retail activities temporarily to Design Yard in Temple Bar, before eventually opening the National Craft Gallery in Kilkenny in the year 2000. Now, the National Craft Gallery has been on many levels a fantastic success, but since Dublin is the centre of the national press, the location of the Craft Gallery at 100 kilometres remove almost certainly reduced the likelihood of regular critical coverage. This wonderful photograph of our past president, Mary Robinson, encountering a craft object in 1991 was unfortunately never published. On an international scale, the most interesting conversations about craft, I find, are taking place within academia. Over the past 30 years, these conversations have been developed to the extent that there is now a significant body of scholarship that offers craft an articulated critical and ideological base. However, Irish makers are frequently isolated from this debate. Now, this picture, it's not hugely relevant. It's Krista Reichel and Nora Golden, who ran the Flower House in Ballydehob in the late 1960s. And their activities, wonderful, energetic activities, their dream of West Cork as a lesbian craft community, which unfortunately never materialised. They were an example of the tremendous energy of the crafts movement that was just really completely isolated from the mainstream, which they would also have seen as the hierarchy, and they're probably quite glad not to be part of it. But my point is that since most makers in Ireland do not teach within the university and college system, there's relatively little interaction between those who write about craft and those who make it. Scholarly writing about craft remains within academic publishing circles and quite rarely reaches Irish makers. Jim Denison, writing in Craft Review in 1987, commented that as long as there is no interface between craft producers, educators and others, nothing will really change. All will follow a policy of self-interest and look with indifference or suspicion on the others. Kind of think that's what happened. It's resulted in a situation where makers and academics have isolated themselves. And I've experienced that situation as if the makers and academics are in different rooms, that there's a door between the rooms, but nobody realizes that it can open. And this is why I would really welcome the Interchanges program, because, okay, it's one thing. It may not completely open the door, but at least it's oiling the hinges. And I just want to finish with this beautiful pictures, which aren't hugely relevant either. This is Lilias Mitchell, who I just started the textile department here. And she's pictured with Morford Roberts. Lilias Mitchell is on top. And they ran the Golden Fleece weaving workshops in Dublin in the 1940s. So they were right at the start of the studio crafts movement. Okay, thank you. If anybody's, do you want to open the questions up for everybody, or well, do you want to take a cut yourself? Yeah. Does anybody have any questions?
How do you suggest we sort of move forward to kind of oil the hinges a bit more, kind of progress things? In your what have you discovered might point forward?
Well, there is this tremendous body of scholarship out there, and you know, that writers like Glenn Adamson and Tanya Harrod and writers in America. I think the more that we're aware of those works and the more we read them, the better. My big thing is history. I feel that the history, certainly the period that I'm studying, studio crafts between 1970 and 1990, mid-1990s, there's room for another 3 or 4 PhDs out of there. And so little has been written down that it's very important, I think, that it's researched now while there are people around to talk to. And the other thing I think is hugely important is archiving. There is written material, and it's mostly in boxes in people's attics. And craft makers don't really think of themselves as very important. They don't realise that the box in the attic may be the only record of an exhibition that turns out to be pivotal. And I want to draw everybody's attention to the Noel archive here in NCAD. It's a publicly accessible archive that is doing the wonderful job of collecting ephemeral documents like exhibition invitations, catalogues, to do with all aspects of the visual arts. If you have a box in the attic, or you know somebody that does, you're wondering if it's important, you don't know what to do with it, don't throw it out, let Noel look at it, because the documents in there may be crucially important to writing down our craft history. And I feel that unless we write down the history, how do we know where to go? You know, unless we know who we are and where we've come from, how do we move on? Sorry, that was a round robin answer.
No, the other question is, because I'm part of a group leading exhibition in the last year, and we tried to get, you know, attention from, tried to get critics down, we tried all these things because we just felt, right, you know, get a dialogue going. Why do you think, or what do you think is the main reason that stopped? You know, why did things change at the end of the 80s? I know the lifestyle thing came on, I mean, that was huge, but at the same time, why did writers stop writing in the newspapers now? And I'm talking about art.
Okay. Well, I asked Aidan Dunn about this yesterday because I was concerned that, having written the talk, I was wondering if I'd missed anything. And the point, now he's the main art critic for the Irish Times. And in the 1980s, writing for the Tribune, sort of been through and early 90s, writing for the Tribune, he reviewed a lot of craft, and he does it extremely well. So I asked him, had he lost interest? He said, not at all. He loves writing about craft. He's very interested in it, and he thinks some of the exhibitions we have on are fantastic, and that the standard has improved hugely. What happened in the 1990s was that fine art activity in Ireland increased almost tenfold, he said. The critics were run off their feet trying to cover it. It took up literally all the available space. The Irish Times only has so much space for culture. And I mean, that's the publication I know best.
So they might look at craft, they say, well, that's already covered under lifestyle. And there was enough visual art with the fine art to fill those spaces. Also, I mean, we have fewer newspapers. I mean, the Irish press has gone. So I think there are reasons that are absolutely nothing to do with either craft or art, that are only to do with publishing.
I wonder if you think it might also, I mean, are there not economic reasons and kind of changing tastes and changing kind of cultural values in terms of what's being consumed at a particular time? Because I remember when I was writing about design for the Sunday Times, and there was a certain amount of disdain for, not disdain, but like natural materials, you know, certain kind of craft values where there was a certain amount of disdain and this kind of rush to embrace what was seen as kind of a more kind of, you know, more modern style.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Because I mean, Lisa's Sunday Times column on design, which included some craft topics, was brilliant because it was in the culture section, and it was analytical, and it was serious. So that was actually quite unusual, I think, to have writing on craft in that position in a newspaper. I did an interiors column with the Sunday Times for 4.5 years, and I was banned from writing about craft. And I'd always would manage to write about craft, but I call it something else. Like, they didn't know that silver was craft, so I was always able to, and they didn't know that glass was craft, but ceramics was dodgy because they knew that was pretty much definitely craft.
Anything would be.
See, certain amendments got to do with attitudes, because, you know, Alexander Calder and his jewellery was very acceptable in Imola. And that's the only time in my memory that I can remember of something that was perceived as, do you know what I mean, the wearable pieces were in a National Museum in terms of, and I get a visual arts place in terms of, so there's a lot of kind of views out there, you know.
Well, I think also with funding, I mean, Circa have, apart from the craft issue, they did one craft issue, I think it was at 91, the Circa did a craft issue, but they haven't covered craft exhibitions, and I think a lot of that is to do with the Circa's public funding came through the Arts Council. The Craft Council public funding comes through the Trade and Industry, or whatever the department happens to be called at the time. And I think people funded by the Arts Council are going, well, they're getting money from the other guys. And I think the way that crafts have been funded, although it's been great in lots of ways for people setting up businesses, has created more of a gulf between art and craft than needs to be.
Yes, definition.
I think as well that it might be. I think a lot of the writing on craft in the 80s in Ireland tended to take a fairly formalist approach, which I think a lot of writing on craft in the 80s would have taken a fairly formalist approach.
and I think with kind of shifts in fine art and so on, there was seen to be less compatibility in a way, and the kind of crafts that were, or design that were kind of taken seriously by cultural establishment in the 90s and noughties. For example, there was an exhibition of Philip Tracy hats in IMA, were ones that were seen to be formally akin to fine art. So it was never kind of design or craft on its own terms. It was always, I remember the kind of the publicity around the Philip Tracy exhibition was, these are akin to sculpture, or, you know, it was always making a parallel with fine art, and as if this craft is so good, it's almost fine art. So I think just the hierarchy was very reinforced. And when there was a shift from a kind of Greenbergian formalism in writing about fine art, and it was more difficult to write about craft. I think critics here might have found it more difficult to write about craft and to take it seriously in its own terms. Because I think in the 70s and 80s, you could write about craft in terms of a kind of arts and crafts kind of formalist, modernist type approach. And when it was a very specific kind of value system enforced, kind of truth materials and so on. And I think that might have been part of the shift then in the 90s, is that fine art and craft kind of writing diverged, and so the same person maybe couldn't have done both anymore. I don't know, I mean, that's just a personal take on it.
I know that artists and makers, I spoke to Bernadette Magna about it, who, when she started in the 70s, she was perfectly happy bridging the divide. She exhibited and entered competitions as an artist, and she exhibited and entered competitions as a craftsperson, working mainly in batik for both. She said in the early days she was comfortable with that and that worked well, but her feeling was that now you can't do that. She feels that you have to come down on one side or the other now, and she sort of quite formally identifies as an artist and isn't really involved in the craft world anymore. I'm not sure if this is everybody's experience, and I'm not sure. Yeah,
I think it is. I mean, a lot of my colleagues, we would tend to, you know, you're either a conceptual artist or you're a designer, and a lot of my colleagues would use the word design to cover what they do in terms of, instead of always using the word craftsworker or anything like that. For that reason, for the reasons of association or, you know, how it's perceived.
I mean, I feel that the word craft is certainly in the media. In the media, the word craft is a bit of a dirty word, and it carries all sorts of connotations of folksiness. Sandals. Yeah, I really had that in the Sunday Times. I had people saying, no, that's the hippies down country. I have to finish now. Mary's tapping her watch.
Oh, right. Well, maybe she gives us a few minutes because there's a coffee break now.
I know, I don't, anyway, I'll just be ranting now.
Yeah. That's to do with Celtic Tiger,
it's to do with the Celtic Tiger and cultural values, and you can tie it in. I mean, we don't value our music in the same way that we did in the 80s, so it's a bigger discussion, I think, that we can have here. I'm very keen on the word craft, and I want to stand up for it and to stand by it, and not to abandon it. And I feel it's very important to, you know, just as if there is this tide and this prejudice, not to go along with it. I don't think we need to go along with it. I think we should fight it. Anyway, listen, thank you very much.